who is going to tell us about Chapter 2 of the Fiscal Monitor, which is a really interesting deep dive into some of the issues that have been very topical recently, including the rise of industrial policy. Thanks so much for being here with us today. So, we've seen a lot of programs be put in place by the United States, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and this kind of industrial policy has been going on for a long time in China. Looking at that in this chapter, you've sort of mapped out the implications and also some of the dangers, the consequences of, can you tell us what you found? What possible ways are there for countries to use fiscal policy to stimulate innovation in technologies that they want to see without incurring negative consequences, spillover effects? What's the secret sauce?
Okay, thank you so much, Andrea. So you're right, industrial policy is seeing a resurgence in many large economies. And this is in part motivated by economic and national security concerns, and also the hope of reigniting really lackluster productivity growth that we were seeing in many parts of the world. And some of this is shaping up in the form of specific subsidies or directed support to green and advanced technologies. The question is this the right approach? In the Fiscal Monitor, we looked at both the economic costs and benefits of using industrial policy. And what we find is that industrial policy can deliver economic returns if, and these are important caveats, if the subsidies are directed towards sectors that generate high knowledge spillovers to other sectors in the economy, and if the social benefits or the externalities can really be well identified. In fact, we show that the welfare gains from such a policy when it comes to accelerating the development of green technologies to lower carbon emissions can be quite high. But, and here's the important caveat, but there is a risk, and there's a large risk, that these policies can be subject to capture by special interests. There could be a massive misallocation of resources, and in that instance, countries may not really realize the benefits of these policies. In fact, because these policies rely on costly subsidies and tax breaks, the gains can quickly turn negative. In addition to that, many of these policies involve discriminating against foreign firms, and such policies can be self-defeating. They can trigger retaliation by trading partners, and so they can be very costly overall. So on balance, we say that if countries are going to deploy such industrial policies, they really need very strong administrative and technical capacity to vet these projects. Countries should have information about the nature of market failures, about the linkages across sectors. They should be able to calibrate support as conditions change, and really ensure that principles of competition and free trade are upheld.
Well, let's talk about why this is important. I mean, improving growth prospects, as you said, is essential given that we were seeing high government debt, aging populations, climate change, and also, divergence between the progress in developing and emerging nations and advanced economies. So what is it that you see, to what extent can advances in digital and climate-friendly or green technologies help improve productivity? What data do you have? I noted that you found that increasing R&D support would have a pretty big impact. Can you just talk a little bit about what the gains would be?
Sure. So what we advocate in the report is a complementary mix of policies, of fiscal instruments, if you will, that can help support productivity growth and more generally. And this can include public funding for basic and fundamental research that has really been underfunded in recent decades. It can include other complementary fiscal instruments such as tax breaks or grants for innovative firms. And we estimate that such a complementary mix of policies could actually spur productivity growth. In fact, we estimate that higher spending on this mix of policies by about 0.5 percentage points of GDP, which is about 50% of the current level in OECD economies, could increase GDP over the long term by about 2%. And such a spending on innovation can also lead to lower debt to GDP ratios, which is really important at this juncture of elevated fiscal, of elevated debt and limited fiscal space that we see in many countries. So in other words, such a policy mix could pay for itself. And these type of policies are particularly important for technologically advanced economies, such as advanced economies in some large emerging market countries.
Why aren't more countries taking this approach? I mean, the data is pretty clear. If you can boost your spending by 0.5% of GDP and get a return on investment, that is quite high, why has there been such a drop-off in the kind of spending on fundamental research?
It's interesting. We've seen this across the board in advanced in economies and also some of the large emerging market countries, that there's been sort of a shift in innovation policy in recent decades. And so governments have increasingly tilted away from public research and development towards incentivizing research and development efforts by private firms. So in the Fiscal Monitor, we show that while public R&D efforts have sort of remained relatively flat, funding for basic fundamental research that kind of powers technological breakthroughs or major scientific breakthroughs has really stagnated. And even as the implicit subsidies for private research and development efforts or R&D efforts have almost tripled since 2000. So there's been a greater reliance on private activity, private R&D activity. And this is paradoxical, because while private R&D has been going up, we see that productivity has been actually declining in many advanced economies. And this is sort of a long-standing structural trend. So clearly there's a role for fiscal policies, particularly to fuel and to stoke funding on basic fundamental research. And I mean, in very simple terms, this is adding to the stock of knowledge. It has widespread applications, whereas applied research tends to be much more commercially oriented. So it takes the stock of knowledge and converts it into products and processes. And because firms don't fully reap profits from all the various applications that fundamental research has, they tend to underinvest in it. And this kind of creates a case for public policy interventions. In fact, public policy support for fundamental research can be even higher. Sort of the gains can be even higher when we look at areas where there are large social benefits. For instance, lowering greenhouse gas emissions or improvements in public health. And a really striking example of this is the COVID vaccine, where after, where scientists were able to pull together decades of research in many different fields that was funded by governments to develop the mRNA vaccines.
So when you're looking at this, just overall picture, what risks do you see? I mean, if this doesn't happen, or if countries don't do this, will productivity just continue to sort of bumble along?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that I'd like to highlight here. First is that a lot of these instruments that the Fiscal Monitor talks about, these are well known, as you said, to governments. Governments have known about this, but there's really no consensus on the cost effectiveness of such a policy package. And this is really important at the current juncture where debt levels are high and countries have more limited room for maneuver. The second thing is that there's been very little sort of evidence, hard evidence, if you will, that we could draw upon in terms of what works and what doesn't. So what the Fiscal Monitor does is that it sort of canvasses, or it does a meta-study, if you will, of all the available empirical research, as well as draws on new research to show what works and what doesn't. And what we find is that there's certain types of fiscal policies that have a larger bang for the buck, if you will, and fundamental research is one. It has broader applications in many different fields. It also has very strong complementarities with private research and development. So that's one. The second important thing that we find is that the design and targeting of these policies really, really matters. So for instance, not all of these instruments are good for all activities or for all types of firms. Providing subsidies requires really strong administrative capacity on the part of government and technical capacity on the part of governments. Grants, for instance, research and development grants are most useful for innovative startups. And if we want there to be more applied research, then we need to ensure that tax incentives are more accessible to a large swathe of firms and not just restricted to large established firms that use these types of tax incentives to cement their market power and to potentially stymie innovation done by other firms. The Fiscal Monitor also talks about the importance of a complementary suite of tax, procurement, trade, competition, financial sector policies to ensure a level playing field, to ensure that countries rely on open trade, to ensure that there is no concentration of market power.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about digital trade, we talked about technologies and climate, green technologies. What about AI? It's, there's a lot of attention to it right now. Technology has already matured in that area to the commercial adoption phase. So what are the pros and cons of countries using their fiscal instruments to speed or perhaps even slow AI? Like, have you looked at that in any detail?
That's a very good question, and I should preview some of the research that's coming out of the Fiscal Affairs Department that's going to be looking specifically at fiscal policies for broadening the gains from AI, particularly generative AI. And this is something that we will be releasing later in this year in May. So there's a lot of hype and a lot of talk about AI, the potential benefits, how it could really be a magic cure for productivity growth, how it could boost productivity, how it could benefit governments in terms of improving service delivery through GovTech, how it could really augment worker capabilities. But there's also risks, and there are massive risks associated with the challenges for labor markets, the potential disruption that it could have for labor markets. But there's, again, a lot of uncertainty in terms of how these benefits will materialize, over what time frame, how disruptive this technology could be for labor markets. And we've done some work thinking about the potential labor market impacts at the fund already. Our forthcoming paper is going to zoom in more in terms of how can fiscal policies be made fit for purpose. So for instance, how can social protection systems be upgraded to alleviate or cushion the negative impacts for labor markets or any adverse distributional consequences it could have? What types of education, skills, training policies do we really need so that workers can benefit? And how should tax systems be made fit for purpose in this world of very rapid and transformative technological change? There's also a question of, should we steer innovation in AI and deployment? Should governments be doing this? And here, we feel that it would be very important to steer deployment of AI in areas where there's large social benefits, such as in education or in public health or addressing climate change. And policies can also be used to see ways in which labor productivity could be enhanced or human capabilities could be enhanced through the use of AI.
So a very targeted approach is kind of what you're advocating there. And
we're targeting sort of a risk-based approach in terms of ensuring that our policy instruments are fit for purpose, that they can sort of cope with both the business's usual scenarios as well as potentially very disruptive scenarios. At the same time, we're advocating an approach that is deliberate in terms of thinking about the potential benefits for society at large.
Terrific. Can you talk about some examples where government direction to incentivize innovation in specific sectors has worked and where it hasn't? There's a box in the chapter that looks at some of these examples. Can you just run us through a few of, like, what's happened in the past and what lessons you derive from that?
Yeah. So, the whole industrial policy discussion, as you know, is subject to large debate, and there's a lot that we don't know about what seems to work and what has worked, what doesn't seem to work. But there's a lot that we also know about some of the failures and successes. And overall, the sort of the message that comes out when you look at some of these specific programs is that history tells us that getting industrial policy right can be a tall order. I mean, history is replete with examples of sort of failed experiments, very costly experiments, policy mistakes, and just bad timing. Sometimes the intention was good, but the timing was wrong. And even when some of these policies succeeded in transforming certain firms or raising productivity, a lot of them ended up resulting in a misallocation of resource or an inefficient use, if you will, of resources. So in the Fiscal Monitor, we talk about some of these policies that were less successful. So this is, the Minitel, this was France's predecessor, if you will, to the internet. Japan's policy to develop computer systems for artificial intelligence, perhaps ahead of its time, and the U.S.'s synthetic fuel program. There were a whole host of these kinds of policies that even advanced economies with relatively strong institutions and administrative capacity put in place that didn't seem to go anywhere. Even in cases where these policies have been relatively successful, if you will, in terms of in transforming industries, and here are two examples that the Fiscal Monitor looks at is Airbus. So this is sort of Europe's response to Boeing, and electric vehicles in China. Even when, these are examples where there has been massive transformation of the sector that took place. With the benefits also came sort of this long tail of negative spillovers, costly disputes, and the fiscal costs of these types of programs were very high. And the Fiscal Monitor is really trying to sort of emphasize that we should be focusing on the receipts, if you will. How large do these things cost? And what are the opportunity costs and trade-offs associated with these kinds of programs?
So I think you're putting out a blog as well that says that, industrial policy isn't a magic bullet. I mean, that's basically the bottom line. It's like this, don't count on this to sort of jumpstart your economy. Be very judicious in terms of choosing these policies. You also warn really strongly and firmly against policies, as you have in our conversation already, that discriminate against foreign firms. Can you just walk me through that a little bit more? What's the downside of discriminating, and how do countries strike the right balance? In the United States, there's been a strong kind of move to limit the technology that is offered to China, and or even to limit Chinese investment, with the idea of ring fencing particularly sensitive or dual use technologies. I mean, how do countries do that? And also encourage their own domestic countries to innovate without triggering this cascade of negative consequences?
So in the Fiscal Monitor, we're developing basically a conceptual framework to think about the economic costs and benefits associated with industrial policies. And we don't really specifically go into the details of what individual countries are doing or to evaluate these types of policies. But that said, in our recent Article 4 reports for countries, we've been cautioning countries against using these types of policies to avoid distorting global trade and investment flows. And that's particularly important at this juncture of low global productivity growth. We've talked about the importance of ensuring a level playing field across firms, not just foreign firms, but also within the domestic economy, ensuring that large established firms don't get a large share of the incentives that are being put on the table out there. So the importance of creating a level playing field. And more generally, the importance of fostering international cooperation, of free flow of ideas, free exchange of ideas. And in the Fiscal Monitor, we specifically mention that this is particularly important because even in large advanced economies, a large share of innovation is imported from abroad. Right? So it can be such type of policies can actually be self-defeating. It can prevent countries from reaping the benefits of really pushing out the technology frontier. And it can entrench geoeconomic fragmentation, which to the detriment of global growth and productivity. And here, emerging market and developing economies that really rely on foreign technology transfer when it comes to the green and digital technologies look to lose the most. Mm-hmm. So the emphasis of the Fiscal Monitor is really on international cooperation, on open trade, on free exchange of ideas, and all countries should move in that direction if they're going to benefit from the potential sort of positives associated with green and digital transformations.
I mean, you spoke there about the contribution, that this divergence between developments in developing and emerging market economies and advanced economies. The contribution of those countries, the emerging market countries, has grown in terms of innovation, but it is still far, far away from the advanced economies. So what advice do you give countries when they're coming? They'll be here next week for the IMF and World Bank spring meetings. When you meet with ministers and central bankers, for that matter, what are you saying to them about what they can do to ensure, or to keep on that trajectory of growth and convergence, and what can they be doing at home if they don't have the big, kind of far cutting edge technologies at their fingertips? What can they do to help their own populations?
I think that's an excellent question, Andrea, because we've seen that productivity growth has slowed not just in advanced economies, but also in emerging market and developing economies. They've seen much more scarring in the wake of COVID, and we also see that convergence gaps have widened in many parts of the world. So restoring growth, restoring productivity growth, reigniting productivity growth is of utmost importance. In the Fiscal Monitor, we talk about the importance of technology adoption, the diffusion or technology transfer for emerging market and developing economies. Homegrown innovation is costly, and these countries tend to rely much more on innovation that is done elsewhere, also to build their own innovative capacity. And here, technology or knowledge that's embodied in foreign direct investment or their imports of goods and services is really important. And the Fiscal Monitor talks about the importance of enabling conditions for countries to adopt technologies that are developed elsewhere. And here, we show that investments in human capital, so education spending, investments in strategic infrastructure such as physical, roads, ports, and digital infrastructure can be extremely important for them to facilitate technology adoption and also to spur productivity in these economies. So for instance, we show that 1% of GDP, 1 percentage points of GDP, higher spending on education in emerging market and developing economies. So essentially this is like closing the gap with advanced economies, can actually lead to faster technology transfer, greater adoption of existing technologies, and also lead to a higher growth of about 2% over the medium term. So investing in the right kind of education, upgrading their digital infrastructure, making it easier for them to absorb and to adopt green technologies can really help them harness the benefits of ongoing green and digital transformations.
What can advanced economies do, and to what extent do they have a responsibility to ensure that developing countries and emerging markets are not left behind and are not shut out of this? I mean, I'm thinking about the U.S. push to deepen its ties with Africa, and I had the pleasure of accompanying Treasury Secretary Yellen on a 3-country tour of Africa, but many other U.S. officials have gone there. So is there some model that would allow advanced economies to kind of offer a hand to developing countries to ensure that they don't miss out on that boat? Are we talking about industrial partnerships? Are we talking about research partnerships? What kind of models are there for ensuring that the growth is better diffused or better spread out?
So here I think I'd like to make 3 points, Andrea. The first is that take climate change. Many of the technologies that are needed to adapt to climate change or even to tackle climate change are widely available. Many of the technologies that are needed in emerging market and in developing economies are widely available, but they don't always have access to it. So how can advanced economies help? Ensuring that these type of technologies that are absolutely critical for emerging market and developing economies to be able to combat climate change are readily available. And this will require technology transfer, this requires funding. So there's a suite of things that countries can do from that perspective. Secondly, inward-looking policies by large advanced economies or large emerging market economies stymie the potential for these countries to catch up. Right? So they create winners and losers, insiders and outsiders, and it essentially curtails the global technology frontier and prevents these countries from benefiting from technology diffusion. My third point is that even if these technologies are available and countries don't put up large barriers, not all of these technologies that are developed in advanced economies are applicable to emerging market and developing economies. So there can be a technology mismatch. And it's very important for global innovation policy to think about how to close these gaps, these technology mismatch gaps, particularly when it comes to tackling climate change.
We're almost out of time, but I want to ask you as we're getting to the end, after you do a deep project like this and you write a chapter, does it change things within the IMF? I mean, do you have conversations? Are you having conversations now, both with the members and at the shareholder level, but also among senior officials about what you found? Like, just tell me about that a little bit from the inside, Yeah,
no, I mean, there's a lot of conventional wisdom, for instance, on what works, what doesn't when it comes to industrial policies. Here we provide a unified framework to think about the benefits and costs of industrial policy. And so this can be a very important way of thinking about these kinds of policies in many different settings. So that's one way. We're also at the same time compiling data on industrial policy, where it's being used and how, and that also can help inform policy discussion. In our bilateral surveillance and our bilateral engagement with member countries, we're looking at specific innovation policies, depending upon our area of expertise and the objective of these innovation policies and their ramifications. We're evaluating them and discussing potentially better policies that countries could adopt. We're also looking at the broader spectrum of fiscal, tax, public financial management, trade policies that countries can adopt to create or to facilitate domestic innovation, but also to foster technology adoption. And finally, in the context of our capacity development activities, we're looking at the design of some of these policies and how they could be implemented in order to foster innovation.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Ira. It's been fascinating.
Thank you, Andrea.
Learning about this, and we're looking forward to the AI paper in May.
Thank you.
We thank you very much.
Thank you.